Hello, everyone. It's the end of the month, so it's time for another edition of our monthly AI Ask Me Anythings. If you didn't catch the last one, as a reminder, this is a monthly convening where I get to talk about all the different things happening in the AI and education ecosystem and catch you all up to all the headlines. We know that there are a lot of product updates, a lot of regulatory updates, and it's difficult to navigate it all. So hopefully this is a place where you can continue to ask questions, get the latest. There is a Q&A function, so please do include any questions. We'll have time at the end. I'm hoping for at least 15 minutes or more of Q&A. Last time it was really, really helpful, so please be sure to include your questions. So in terms of things we'd like to cover today, there are a couple of key themes I wanted to highlight, including talking generally about what we're seeing in terms of AI effects on society. So specifically around what we're seeing around entry-level jobs. Second, I want to cover a lot of what we're seeing around the product releases, especially coming from the big AI labs. And then some interesting education workforce-specific releases like CZI's shared infrastructure that they just released yesterday. And talking about Workday's acquisition of Sana Labs for $1.1 billion last week, as well as some regulatory updates. But one of the most pressing ones that has come up over and over again in my conversations with founders, with institutions, is just what we're seeing around the labor market and how the geometries of our economy are changing in terms of what tasks are needed. And you're seeing this disproportionately affect college graduates because AI is so good at automating routine grunt work, which historically, that's what college graduates have filled. In many ways, you could see how our traditional covenant is that college graduates go to their entry-level roles. They do 2 years of grunt work in exchange for on-the-job learning, tacit knowledge of getting experience. However, that entire contract is actually now under strain because AI is doing all that work. So some interesting research coming out, especially from Stanford. There's a great piece called Canaries in the Coal Mine that came out recently. But a lot of people have, again, anecdotally been sounding the alarms about the hiring freezes that are happening, the unusually high rate of college grads who are still unemployed from this current class. And some of the numbers they reveal, including after looking at millions of payroll data from ADP, they found that the effects are definitely concentrated on entry-level workers in occupations most exposed to AI, whereas older, less exposed workers are largely unaffected. And you can see how this plays out where, for example, if you think about even coding, where we're seeing really stark hiring freezes and slimmings of teams, it's because the role of a great software engineer has really shifted and abstracted to a higher level of managing an army of AI agents that you direct, and you go to bed for 7 hours, you wake up and code is complete. You're really overseeing and debugging, identifying issues. You're not necessarily ones building, which is what historically entry-level software engineers have done. So you've really seen the value accrue to the managerial layer. And then, they specifically also highlight software developers in particular are seeing 22 to 25 are seeing a 20% decline in employment through mid this year. Overall employment is growing, but again, not for young workers. And you're particularly seeing that right now today impact software engineer roles as well as call center customer service roles. That's where we're seeing the most immediate impact. And that's where you're seeing pure automation. Whereas in other industries, you're seeing a more balanced combination of automation plus augmentation. And in jobs where you have that augmentative AI function, you're actually seeing positive or neutral growth. A lot of people have countered some of the discourse around job replacement with AI by pointing to growth actually in healthcare and education. So, mixed arguments, but generally the numbers are showing, even, outside of these studies from Stanford, looking at what Signal Fire puts out, they showed that among 15 of the largest tech companies, entry-level share of new hires fell 50% since 2019, 7% in 2024, and 11% in 2022. Handshake, just even from a demand standpoint or a demand point, they have entry-level postings down 15% year over year, and applications per job are up 30%. As I mentioned, you're seeing kind of coding be the first space where you're seeing this massive mismatch play out, and it is tough because a lot of people have paid for, prior to the generative AI era, STEM and coding were seen as one of the most reliable job paths, and that's been completely upended. And computer science grads are actually disproportionately struggling to land jobs. And I think part of that is also what we've been kind of internally thinking around this almost Tinderization of the labor market, where obviously there's a massive mismatch between the supply and demand of roles currently available, and AI is transforming and creating this need for a recalibration. But at the same time, it's also contributing to how extreme that mismatch is, and all the noise in the space. So I think on one hand, you have on the demand side for these roles, people just using AI to churn out hundreds of applications in hours, which prior to the AI era, there was a limit to how many you could pump out. And on the flip side, HR is basically, and recruiters are basically getting thousands of applications. We've heard from startups in our portfolio where they have one job posting, and in one day they'll get 2,000 plus applications. So there's just a lot of noise, and it's difficult to actually pinpoint where there is a task and skill match, even amidst all the the skill mismatch with the AI. So there's not only the AI-induced replacement function, but also the fact that the system of connecting labor is breaking as well. And I think consequently that means that a lot of people are questioning the value of the degree. There's another stat that I think 49% of Gen Z are questioning the value of a college education. You're seeing this decline here as well, where it was very 80% of people thought it was very important to get a college education. Now that actually sits a lot lower at 35%. So I think what's pretty clear here is that the current system of putting people through 4-year degrees in order to upskill them for and I think it's important to differentiate, the standard 4-year undergraduate degree versus other types of degrees. But I think what's pretty clear is that taking time out of the labor force to educate yourself and upskill yourself isn't leading to mobility within the labor force, just because one, the half-life of skills is decreasing so significantly that the institutions we're putting people through are not keeping up. And two, there's just declines in declines in the credentialing signal of some of these degrees. So generally, I think the big takeaway here is that canaries are the entry level, but there's been discussion of this moving upstream. Google recently eliminated 35% of their middle managers. They basically either returned to individual contributors because they didn't see as much need for humans to play orchestrator. So it's not just entry level. There are questions of whether or not this moves upstream into management as well. And I think what's becoming abundantly clear is that AI is a very good substitute for codified knowledge. So what schools are teaching. However, what you can get from experience is tacit knowledge, and that is stuff learned on the job. So I think there needs to be new models that are higher velocity that fill this gap. We're looking for interesting models. We're curious about how this will play out. But I think right now we are at a place where, you're seeing all these signals from the labor market. You're seeing these gaps. And in the midst of all this chaos, we know that hopefully startups and they don't even need to be startups, but better solutions institutions will hopefully emerge. And if you're interested in all of this, earlier this week, had a great conversation with a bunch of folks, including, the CEO of Pearson, the president of WGU, the CIO of the U.S. Department of Labor, Mike Clementi, who's the chief human resources officer of Bridge, we all discussed what this looks like and how they're thinking about it, whether it's from the higher ed standpoint or how this flows into the workforce. And if you haven't checked out our recent Learning and Earning report, we have an entire theme dedicated to the fallout from automation of entry-level jobs, where we discuss all of this and our predictions for it. So I would recommend checking that out. In terms of product updates, I really wanted to call out one specific one from Google called Learn Your Way. So this product is something that they're positioning as replacing the one-size-fits-all model of traditional textbooks. And they basically propose a system of using Gemini 2.5 Pro to transform static textbooks into personalized multimodal learning experiences. So this currently sits in Google Labs, which is where they experimented with Notebook LM. It's really where they have previewed a lot of other tooling like storytelling apps, historical archive apps. So that's a good place to check out if you're thinking about what Google specifically is working on. And Learn Your Way basically, instead of just getting reading text, what you get is content that is one, adapted to grade level and personal interests. But I think what's even more powerful and where you can see them really leaning into where Google has their strengths is in those multiple representations. So if you are an avid Notebook LM user, you'll see that there are a lot of similarities in the core infrastructure of what they're putting out here. You're able to pretty quickly switch between slides, audio lessons, mind maps, while also having embedded practice within it. And you've seen Google experiment with different variations of parts of these tools, right? YouTube started thinking about embedding quizzes within YouTube. You have Google Classroom and embedding all these teacher tools. Notebook LM is a fantastic example of you upload material and it turns into an audio lesson. It turns into a mind map. So for some reason, I am not able to go to the next slide. But here we go. And so you can check out all of these from the Learn Your Way website. They have a couple preset ones, but the future is that you can upload any content at all. I can upload the paper that I was just talking about and get a better understanding of it. I just have to tell it that I'm a middle schooler or high schooler. I'll tell it my interest, and it'll tailor certain parts of the content to that level and those content interests. So right now they're giving us preset templates. However, the future is that, similar to Notebook LM, you can upload any material and it'll help you transform it into a lesson. In terms of the product, it really is a two-step AI pipeline. On one side, they have that text personalization. So right now, I personally think it's relatively superficial. They're able to adapt at grade level. If you share a personal interest, it'll start bringing up analogies or examples tied to sports or gaming. But I think what, again, as I mentioned, is very exciting is that content transformation, this ability to turn text into multiple views between slides, lessons, mind maps. And the ability to do that in a packaged multimodal format is actually pretty difficult technically. So it's exciting to see them, piece together all these things that they've spent the last few years building in a packaged product. But would highly recommend checking that out right now. But they also, again, have assessment built in, which is another interesting feature. So I was going to show a bunch of images where they actually have multiple choice questions embedded into paragraphs as you're reading it. They also have section level quizzes with feedback. And so what's interesting is you can see how this becomes really powerful eventually if you're able to embed this in something like Google Classroom. Having that data around both the assessments embedded, but also how students are learning is really powerful. And so in terms of actual outcomes around this, they did run a randomized control trial with, okay, here we go, I think. Yay, okay, awesome. So here's an example of one of the audio lessons that was instantly generated. And then you can see there are other options like building a mind map. Again, this ability to instantly generate this is actually quite difficult. But as I mentioned, around outcomes, they did conduct a randomized control trial with 60 high school students aged 15 to 18 in the Chicago area. So not the biggest sample size, but they basically used Adobe PDF Reader as a control. So reading as if from your laptop or from your computer, compared to the experiment, which was Learn Your Way. And they all studied the same unfamiliar chapter on brain development for adolescents. And what they found was that people who used Learn Your Way scored significantly higher in both immediate and retention tests. So when they were asked to recall information both immediately after a session, as well as 3 days later. And then interestingly, students naturally reported higher engagement and enjoyment as well. In terms of my open questions for all of this, I'm curious about how this translates to other domains. Obviously, this is mostly in a reading setting of information ingestion. It's difficult to see how this actually plays out in other domains where you have math proofs, science. I think that's largely where I still have questions around a lot of these AI tutors, is it feels like we've only really touched the tip of text and maybe reading and content delivery, but not so much learning more hands-on subjects where you do have to, show proof of work and work through certain steps. I think another thing with the study is we don't really know which element mattered most, right? Is it the mind maps? Is it the audio lesson? Is it the personalization? I think a lot more studies to be done around what component drove the biggest gains. I think visuals, as always with all these AI tutors, it's tough to build these educational diagrams. This is not unique to Google. OpenAI struggles with this, Anthropic struggles with this. Even though AI is great at generating images, the reason why it's hard to generate graphs and diagrams is because those are actually very logic driven, versus when you're generating just images, those are diffusion based, meaning that they're starting with one pixel and painting the rest of those pixels in an image way. So that's why it works well if you have a painting or an image, a photo of a cat. It's able to infer based off of the prompts that you have, versus a diagram is a very different set of instructions. And that's why historically, a lot of these labs have not succeeded at that. Other big questions for me are just, I'm curious how curriculum providers and publishers are thinking about this. If all textbooks have to become living AI systems, what does that mean for pricing? What does that mean for content delivery? Who's going to own the AI textbook OS? And when you break it down, where does the value accrue, right? Who is paying, or are you paying for the content? Are you paying for the OS? Or is the person who's doing delivery owning both of those value points? I think those are questions that we're continuing to pay attention to. And then questions just around the ability for teachers to control a lot of this learning experience. I think we're mostly focused on the student user experience right now and that delivery of content, but I'm curious how this plays out when you abstract that into how teachers are able to see how personalization is playing out, or district level controls. Another big product update from one of the biggest AI labs is OpenAI launching ChatGPT for teens. This is basically a version of ChatGPT where they'll embed age prediction systems where they can predict whether a user is under 18 based off of usage patterns. If they're uncertain, it will just actually default to under 18. And interestingly, we'll see how this plays out. In some cases, they may ask for ID, but we'll see how this actually plays out in action. They're actually also modifying the model behavior for teens specifically, where it'll explicitly, or they'll try explicitly block graphic sexual content, refuse flirtatious requests, no depictions of self-harm or suicide. So that's what they're hoping to do. But again, questions around inaction and in execution. Are there ways to work around this? Probably. We've seen many workarounds for guardrails and restrictions with these AI black boxes. But it is exciting that companies like OpenAI are making an intentional step thinking about this, because we do know that teens are using ChatGPT, Gemini, Anthropic with or without the teen version. They're also going to introduce parental controls where I guess they're promising by the end of the month, but you can actually disable memory and history, and then also embed certain blackout hours so that you can't use the system, after bedtime. and then naturally better crisis handling and escalation. Another big thing I wanted to call out was the Workday acquisition of Sana Labs for $1.1 billion. For those a little less familiar, Sana Labs is a AI company that was founded in 2016. They're actually Stockholm based, and they play in the space of learning, knowledge management, and AI agents. They actually started with Sana Learn, which was this learning platform that integrated content creation and course building. And obviously in the generative AI era, they benefited from being able to do things like ingest training materials like documents, videos, recordings of experts. And then their platform can also generate structured courses, lessons, quizzes, even interactive simulations. So that's Sana Learn. It historically tried to be a departure from legacy LMS products, which, if you usually had to have someone do a lot of manual instructional design. Instead, with Sana's technology, you can basically not only generate courses at a much faster pace, but also embed an AI tutor and assistant in their platform. The other core part of their platform is the AI agents piece, where it's basically, I would say, similar to a Glean, if those of you in the workforce learning space are familiar, where you have this enterprise assistant that it acts as a second brain and has access to knowledge across apps, insights, all content, so that it acts as this system that knows everything within your organization. And it's a AI search built specifically for your organization. So they've built a system where these AI assistants can search for information. You use natural language and you say, where can I find this compliance doc? Or, who should I email for this? Those are, lower level questions, but eventually the vision is that you can not only do information retrieval that is specific to your organization, but also actually do actions with that. So it might proactively surface information based off of knowing that you're in L&D. Or it might summarize key points of your unread emails every single morning. So really shifting, if you own the actual information retrieval layer, which they do, then moving into doing things with that information retrieval layer. So that's what they're building. Workday, as many of us know, is a big enterprise cloud platform for HR, finance, and they've increasingly been showing a interest and focus on learning. Historically, I would say they didn't have that comprehensive of a learning suite, but it's pretty clear that with Sana, they're recognizing that there is this combination of knowledge management and productivity. Learning happens at work. And when you combine the two of owning where people work plus the actual learning capabilities, you have a really powerful flywheel. I think the other thing they've recognized is that Sana, for many of these platforms, you have these legacy HR suites. However, what people want is a front door to all that tooling. So are there ways where, similar to what Sana introduced around having a natural language text box where you could say, where can I find this information? Does Sana become the front door to all of Workday's capabilities? I think you're seeing this similarly with Salesforce, thinking about how you can use Slack to process a lot of the agentic actions within Salesforce's suite. So, I think a lot of folks are, and that's why a lot of people are hyperfixated on the browser. You basically want to own both where people work plus the ability to manage agents within that specific system. And when you own both, then you have a really powerful combination. I think the other thing they preempted was, in many ways, there are all these AI agent systems being built, and they all want to access Workday information. They want to sit horizontally across all these platforms. But with that, there is a risk of being disintermediated by these AI agents. And by owning one of these, they make it so that, if you want to use agentic functions within Workday, you don't have to use a third party. You can just embed Workday Sana Labs. Another one I wanted to highlight, especially for the edtech ecosystem, was just around what CZI was putting out in the broader education ecosystem. I haven't had as much time to look through every single doc and all the specific features, but the big things to focus on are, one, them launching a knowledge graph feature, as well as a system of evaluators. But the context for building these is actually, as we all know in the edtech ecosystem, it's very fragmented. There's a lot of stitching between tools and curriculum. And what we do know about maybe edtech 1.0 is that there was a lot of re-engineering and people building similar things. And their CZI's vision is that if they can build more public open infrastructure that is interoperable, then there's tools available that are grounded in learning science, standard, or at least shared data infrastructure. So that was their vision for all of this. And they just essentially wanted to build a common language for learning across edtech tools. And so specifically the knowledge graph tool, you can think of as like a GPS for learning. So they can turn standards, which vary across states, curricula that is siloed, learning progressions, which aren't historically easily mapped, turn all of those into machine readable data sets. And then knowledge graph is the connective tissue between that. So it's not necessarily a flashy app. It is more so a foundational layer that developers can build tools grounded in those standards and pedagogies instead of reinventing the wheel. And that means it lowers the barrier for people to build like education-oriented tooling out of the box. And for teachers, it means that they know that people who've built with this knowledge graph, the tools are probably more coherent, standards aligned, and less random. So you can see how this means a lot less reinventing the wheel. And you can actually, Claude recently did a integration where, as we know, Claude today doesn't really have awareness around standards, state-specific standards, or learning science. So what you can do now is actually plug knowledge graph into Claude via MCP, which is Model Context Protocol. And so the model will then have structured education-specific context. So for example, if you're a teacher, then when you generate lesson plans or problem sets within Claude, those outputs are a lot more relevant and trustworthy. If you're a developer, it means you can embed educational infrastructure into the LLMs, which means they're probably a little less hallucination prone in the education setting. So that's exciting. Shared infrastructure, we love that. It's great for builders. And then the other big thing I wanted to call out was evaluators, which, as we know in education, one of the biggest barriers to AI is trust, because people validly don't want to risk exposing students to content that is inaccurate or too hard or too easy. And so they basically built a QA system for AI that automatically measures rigor, complexity, and appropriateness of content. So even though we can't necessarily look into the black box as much as we would like to, and interpretability is a improving space, this at least gives you a standard evaluation to measure accountability. So for developers, that means you can test your product against standardized benchmarks, but you also have something like these evaluators to test for trust and quality assurance specific to education. So those are really exciting. In the regulatory space, wanted to call out one of the first pieces of legislation around AI that I see moving through on a state level. We obviously have the AI action plan on a federal level and various other guidance, but in terms of bills and actual safety laws, there is SB 53, which is kind of a second iteration of an earlier bill last year that was vetoed by Gavin Newsom because there were fears of stifling innovation. SB 53 is toned down a little bit, where it basically requires companies that are developing large-scale frontier AI systems to disclose their safety testing regimes and certify that they're following them. So this means really companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Perplexity, bigger companies where you're generating more than 500 million in annual revenue. You have to publish safety reports, ideally develop frameworks around risk reduction, And for smaller frontier developers, similar basic high-level testing details. This is probably not as relevant for individual startups or institutions using these AI labs, but it is important to know if you are engaging with these AI labs that this is, if this goes through, something that they need to be upheld to. And given that California is home to 32 of the world's top 50 AI companies, hopefully that means more guardrails and safety reporting. And then this one I wanted to show a video, but unfortunately we can only load PDFs on here. But I wanted to call out a specific company called Alter Ego, just to really highlight how exciting this moment is, in that we're literally living in sci-fi. And as much as we talk about and should be talking about the negatives around AI and fears around what it does to society, those are all important topics that I will always happily talk about. I also think recognizing that we are in a once-in-a-lifetime moment. So maybe talking a little bit about some sci-fi tech. There's a company, Alter Ego, which is one of the world's first near telepathic wearables. So you don't have to have a brain implant. This is just a wearable that you wear like a headset, and it uses bone conduction to identify these minuscule movements around your throat area when you're thinking about verbalizing certain words. So that means that you can actually telepathically communicate with two people or with another person wearing this headset, or you can actually, without speaking, you can intentionally think, please write a note about this and send an email, and that turns it into agentic function. So, I know I focus a lot about AI, but it's also cool to see applications of AI in truly sci-fi settings as well. So right on time, we have about 15 minutes for questions. We will send out the recording afterwards, so you can definitely reference this. Let's see. So one of the first questions is, when seeking to separate AI signal from noise, what's a key question or questions you're asking? This is a really good question. I think it's a framework that we're constantly evolving. I think every company today is an AI company. So I would say we look at, in terms of evaluating them as startups, I think we look at them with the same fundamentals that we look at for every single startup, right? Just because it has AI doesn't mean it necessarily is held to a different standard. I think as venture investors, we're looking for big outcomes, companies that can scale, big ideas that are hopefully reaching millions of users or have scaled impact. So that's kind of the profile that we're looking for. In terms of specifically AI companies, I would say there are a lot of companies that are doing what I feel like are incremental AI, and it makes sense. That's where at least the money is today, because it's what makes sense for users. It's easier to see, let's AI this version. But it feels like a lot of the industry, and not even in education, outside of education as well, there's a lot of let's build AI software to do things faster, cheaper, better, which I do think is exciting. I think there's a lot of opportunity to build there. However, I do think that a lot of these companies are not necessarily thinking about skating to where the puck is heading. So what does it mean to actually be able to process multimodal input and output for the first time? What does it mean to have agentic functions, these systems that can not only generate cognitive units of intelligence, but also act on that intelligence? I think that is completely new. So I think right now it feels like we're in phase one, where we're seeing a lot of startups. Let's AIify this. Let's AIify lesson plans. Let's AIify teacher feedback, which is good, important. Those are important foundations, and there are going to be fantastic companies built out of that. We're investors in a lot of them. However, I'm curious to see how, especially as we look at 5 to 10 year horizons, companies that are really thinking through net new transformations of learning and work. Does it mean that learning lives in the browser? Does it mean that you're taking audio input? How are you able to analyze visual input at scale? So a lot of those questions I think come to mind when we think about, at least for us, what's hot in AI today versus what will be the next big generational companies of the future. Is Alter Ego out of MIT Media Lab? Yes, that is Alter Ego from MIT Media Lab. They are spinning out as a startup, but today we don't have any news of funding timelines. They're still very much so in prototype. I believe right now their specific product has, they say at a 92% accuracy with a 20-second latency. So it's still early. It's probably not ready for primetime consumer use. But yeah, it's a cool sci-fi experiment spun out of MIT Media Lab, and maybe they'll make a consumer version. But I've also seen people talk about how, you could use this for espionage and other nefarious reasons. How can people with AI education ideas, discovery work done, framework validated, but MVP not created, get started with GSV Ventures? So we're always happy to chat. I'm always happy to chat about AI. I love meeting people who are excited about what AI can unlock for education. We're just generally excited to meet innovators in the education space. So there's never too early of a time to get connected with someone on the GSV team. I would say we play at the seed Series A stage. So it really means that it's helpful to have a really fleshed out vision. And oftentimes it's also helpful to have early product signals. It's not required, if it's the right team, it's never too early, and that's the venture game. But I also think it is helpful oftentimes to be able to demonstrate early signals. So even though you might not be monetizing or focused on revenue today, having early signals and proxy signals like time spent on platform with an early beta test of users. Are people consistently returning to this? Do they feel some type of way when you take away this tool from them? Those are questions that act in place of when we don't have information around revenue and willingness to pay. The actual product love is actually, those are interesting indicators that we look at in place of those. The BBC show AI Decode was talking about Google Homework Town this week, saying it does students homework for them and all the implications of that. I'm actually not familiar with Google Homework Town. I don't know. I'm curious what that is. I don't know if I'm as aware of a specific Google homework tooling. But I mean, I think it is very clear that even before the AI era, students were cheating, and they will always find a way to cheat. I think it's been interesting because, for the last 3 years, so much of the conversation, at least on the institutional front, has been dominated by this discourse around cheating, which I think is important. I think it's important to think about the future of, actually developing those metacognitive skills and the ability to learn how to learn. But I also think it's worth remembering that cheating has always existed in previous forms. It was paying people to do your work for you, or Chegg and other solvers. And then today it's AI. So the needle keeps moving. That being said, I do think it is a valid concern just given how much you're able to scale cheating today. I think that just means you need better assessments. The fact that cheating so quickly was able to disrupt every single way that we look and analyze a student, I think just speaks to the ways that today assessments are really just single checkpoints in a learning journey. It doesn't really tell you much about their thought process. Oftentimes you're getting a standardized score. So I think in that sense, I hope it's a gentle push in the direction of actually thinking through how we measure, because I think generally whatever is getting measured, cheating will always happen in response to that. So if it's an essay, if it's a presentation, and I think there's no escaping it. There's a company called Cluely that just raised $15 million from Andreessen. They're basically their entire manifesto is to cheat. And their platform is able to overlay on top of any interview. It can take visual input of what's on your screen as well as audio input. So if you're going through a coding interview, it can see the coding problem that's presented to you. It can hear what the interviewer is asking you, and in real time, it'll generate, you should say this in response, and you should type out this in the IDE to work through the problem in this way. So we have these systems that are able to think for you. It is one, I think, a matter of better assessments that actually holistically and measure learning progress and that ability to learn how to learn. And I think too, I think that's why AI literacy and awareness around AI is so critical, because what we have seen is a very big difference between schools where, or at least classroom environments where AI is at least talked about. I think a good comp we always bring up is AI literacy and knowledge around AI is like sex ed, right? If you don't learn about it through your school, you're probably going to learn about it through your peers, through social media. It's being shoved down their throats through Snapchat AI, Meta AI. So it's not like they're not interfacing with these systems. And so what I worry about is if the education system is just not even having this conversation, the default is that students will rely on it as a crutch. And the default will always be cheating, when AI can clearly be used for much better reasons. But if we're not doing the work of having that conversation, unfortunately, the default becomes the crutch version. A lot of what we're seeing is disruption with a little d. Do you see or do you anticipate seeing K-12 having any big D disruptions and fundamentally changing the way we deliver education? I hope so. I think there are a lot of interesting companies that are doing things with multimodality. For the first time ever, being able to take audio and visual input means that you can see and measure in real time how people are working through problems. I think that's exciting for the world of assessment. There's a lot of classroom intelligence that is that has largely historically been stuck to digital text on screen. What does that mean when you can move classroom intelligence to the entire classroom, real workspaces? And it's not necessarily just about instruction. I think we're seeing systems that based off the classroom transcript or based off of how students have worked through certain problems are able to identify certain student pairings and say that based off of these mastery levels, this student and this student should be paired together. So doing the work of also facilitating better human connection. It's not just let's throw AI in front of human. It's also how do we use AI to facilitate better teacher to student connection, better student to student connection. So I think there are a lot of those. I think in the workforce space, you're seeing examples where that multimodality is playing out. There's a company called Squint that basically takes in visual input and is able to see how people operate machines on the factory floor. It takes that visual input and turns that into personalized guidance. So instead of having to read a manual or having to, maybe reach out to your floor manager who might be preoccupied with a million other things, you have these systems that can basically help you work through step by step your specific workflow. So, and then I know we're at time. Maybe I will try to do one more. In regards to guardrails, are you seeing efforts or plans in place by large LLM providers, or is this something we should be thinking about as a layer between LLM input and output channels? I think the reality is these LLM providers are only going to think about guardrails if they have any consumer interface. So I think Anthropic, OpenAI, Perplexity, because they have a chatbot that is interfacing with consumers at the end of the day, there ultimately has to be some guardrails. However, if you're just talking about pure model, the models themselves, I think about are units of intelligence. Think of them as like a brain or these raw intelligence. So in many ways, I think the model providers are not going to do any work around guardrails and safety because they're just giving you these raw commodities. However, if there is a consumer experience, anyone who's playing in the application layer probably has to think about guardrails and safety. I think, probably an OpenAI, a Anthropic, Perplexity, Google, they're thinking about it really at a general consumer layer. So they're really thinking about safety in the same way that they thought about YouTube and YouTube Kids. or kids versions, and general safety around, certain information being not exposing certain information, or guardrails around self-harm and suicide. So I think that will remain. I don't know if they will go as far as to develop guardrails specifically for education. So maybe Google, in the form of, if they're building Learn Your Way, they will go as far to build guardrails for that product because it is an education product. But I don't think an OpenAI will build education-specific guardrails. I like that Anthropic is thinking about plugging, MCP into something, the CCI infrastructure. I think that's smart, but I don't think they will build in model level guardrails that are focused specifically on, Socratic learning. You're seeing study mode, but those are really at the prompt layer. I wouldn't say they're doing a lot of safety testing, and that's because the truth is they are right now focused and fixated on the everyday consumer or the enterprise worker, and building specific guardrails for climate, for science, for education. Those are things that, maybe when they reach scale, they will have teams to do all that. But for now, I would say there is a need for people to bake in that infrastructure. I think ultimately it lies on, or the onus lies on whoever is delivering the application. So not necessarily the LLM provider, but if you do, either you're an LLM provider with an application layer like a ChatGPT to the OpenAI models, or you are an application like a Magic School or a Brisk that has to, you're ultimately building the delivery experience. So you are in charge of what safety and guardrails look like there. Cool. I know we went over time, but thank you so much for letting me talk to you all and share all the things that have been top of mind for me. If you have any other questions, please feel free to include them. We'll do these once a month. So we'll be back, and looking forward to staying in touch and excited for many more of these.